regarding climate change, right? So it's like, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing, right? So I think we've moved on from the idea that it's not a hoax, but a lot of the solutions and the changes that we need to implement and are starting to implement, things like, livable cities, having more renewable energy, cleaner water and cleaner air, these aren't bad things, right? These are all good things for everybody. And so I think we should just keep that in mind. Try to spin the story to be like, what's the benefit of moving away from fossil fuels? Well, here are some of those benefits. All right, so we finished up on Tuesday talking about the changes we're seeing in our climate system. And so today, let's talk a little bit about what can we do about climate change. And again, these are going to be the big picture. These aren't individual solutions. I'm not stealing anyone's thunder there. Let you use the time in your project to share the solutions. But I'm talking about big picture things like conservation, energy efficiency, carbon-free energies, etc. So here's my little wheel that shows the steps we take. So anything along the purple here is mitigation, mitigating and reducing carbon emissions through conservation, energy efficiency, and carbon-free energy. And then we can intervene, okay? If we can't mitigate or we wait too long to do the mitigation, intervention in the climate system through things like carbon capture and storage and geoengineering, we'll talk about. And then lastly is adaptation. We can do all of these, but also if we don't do the first two, we really will have a lot of adaptation we have to do. But today we're just going to talk about mitigation and intervention because adaptation is only really feasible if you already know kind of what you're going to face. So we're going to talk about these. So conservation is the idea of conserving, right? Using less stuff and reducing our demand for goods and services that produce carbon dioxide or methane, right? So consuming less, right? So thinking about some of the stuff that we consume too much of and how we can reduce our demand for that stuff. One of the major issues is single-use plastics. So fundamentally, plastics are made from petroleum and fossil fuels. So anytime you take a single-use plastic, it doesn't just go away. There is no throwing away. Everything's on this planet, so there's no throwing away. It's just going to somewhere else and getting buried. And so single-use plastics, we also have, for example, cell phones, right? The idea that certain companies really come out with new cell phones often, and that's a lot of resource mining for that. I'm not saying don't get a new cell phone, but make sure you recycle and repurpose your old phone. Don't just throw them in the garbage because all of the minerals and materials that make up that phone can then be reused. Another one is how much meat we consume. So meat, especially red meat like beef, is a huge contributor to the global carbon emissions. So let's think about this for a bit. And of course, there's no right answer here. It's just thinking about our own daily lifestyles. But how often do you eat meat? And when I'm thinking about meat, I'm talking specifically about beef and lamb in this category. You could also include chicken too, but really beef and lamb here because these are the big contributors. All right. So a few of you never eat meat, which is fantastic. And I'm going to show that you don't have to go all in to make an impact. Okay. So a lot of us are eating meat pretty frequently. And I'll admit that in my family, we eat red meat like beef probably once or twice a week. We really try to reduce our impact. But if we look here at the food prints by the diet type, which is basically looking at all the different things we're eating and calculating the total carbon dioxide emissions through the production, manufacturing, all of those steps and the raising of the animals, right? So that's actually where the biggest footprint comes in for beef is the life cycle of the cow itself is a huge carbon dioxide source. So here looking at somebody who is a meat lover that's eating meat pretty frequently, especially that beef and lamb, a huge component, about half of their footprint is from the beef and lamb. And if you reduce your footprint or food print, excuse me, by just reducing the amount of beef or lamb you're eating, or even just going into no beef and lamb, just strictly eating chicken, fish, and pork as your protein, I guess you could consider your meat, you can rapidly, greatly reduce your footprint. And when you go down to vegan or vegetarian, you can see that there's not that much difference. I'm not saying, there's obviously other reasons to have vegetarian or vegan lifestyles, but the overall impact is not as great. Okay, so that age-old kind of, oh, they're going to take away my hamburgers, right? Well, no, you don't have to eat a hamburger every day. You could have one every so often and have a huge impact because then our demand for cattle and cows and the land that we need for cows and cattle would be greatly reduced. All right. And then thinking in the same lines in terms of food, how much of the food grown in the United States or just used in the United States is actually wasted, doesn't end up going into our bodies. All right. So the answer is, in fact, about 30 to 40%, which when you think about that, that's a huge amount. Imagine 1 in 3 bananas getting thrown in the garbage, not actually used. So all of the energy, all of the resources that are going into food production, that is a huge impact. So one of the major ways we can reduce our climate footprint is to help um, with food waste. Okay, so just reducing our food waste. Okay, sorry, was there a question? All right, so conservation. Other ways we can encourage or incentivize conservation has to do with the economy, okay? One thing we have to do is to make businesses held accountable for the disposal or recycling of their products. So for example, recently I had an old TV that stopped working and I couldn't get it repaired. And at the cost point, it was cheaper just to buy a new TV. But I can't just throw a TV away into the garbage. It's actually against the law here in my city. But instead, in order for me to recycle it, it would cost me $50. Now, why is the burden put on me to recycle something that a company should easily be able to take back and use the parts for more technology, right? So there's been a lot of push to make companies more responsible for their products. There's also this idea of putting a price on carbon. For example, calculating how much carbon is going into making that product and then increasing the cost. But of course, that's not equitable. Not everybody can afford an increased tax on certain goods and services. We could also design products to have a longer lifespan, be reusable or fixable, which many companies are starting to do that. For example, Patagonia, the outdoorswear company, they have a lifetime warranty on their products that if something happens, they will replace or fix your product with the idea that we need to stop consuming so much stuff. Of course, by changing our human behaviors, for example, we just mentioned diets and food waste, and then of course by education, which is something that you're doing now, but of course we always need to make sure we're educating more folks. So I'd like to watch this little video. I forgot to load this one, but I like this video. It talks about single-use plastics and just like how prolific they are in our systems, in our society, and how we can try to reduce
solar panels on my roof. But in the back
impacts.
of my mind,
Okay, let's start that over.
okay, so I try to recycle. I've got my grocery tote bag. I even have solar panels on my roof. But in the back of my mind, I can't help thinking, does any of this actually make a difference when it comes to climate change? If you read the headlines, you quickly begin to see that climate change is a massive problem. So is my reusable bag really going to change the world? But not everyone feels that way.
This is all of my trash from the past 4 years.
Oh my God.
This is Lauren Singer. She runs a website where she gives tips and answers questions about living a zero-waste life.
Okay, so you've got tiny little ends and bits and things.
Yeah.
You really telling me everything else that you use for 4 years, you found some other use for?
Totally, is compostable, infinitely reusable, or 100% easily recyclable.
You may look at the extremely eco-friendly way Lauren is living and find it inspiring. Or maybe like me, you're totally skeptical. But a lot of what she's doing is actually pretty simple. When she wants coffee, she brings her own cup. Or let's say she wants to buy a pastry, she'll put it into a reusable cotton bag. A safety razor instead of plastic ones. There's all this disposable stuff in our lives that we're not even thinking about. And what Lauren's done is find some easy substitutes. Everything else ends up in the jar.
This is macaroni and cheese packaging, and this was like 4 years ago, like right when I started. That was my weekend at Dad's house. So these are
I know what these
plastic straws, hot chocolate.
This was a bad day, wasn't it, for you?
No, actually, someone sent that to me in the mail.
These aren't huge trash problems. The EPA isn't up in arms about plastic straws, but you can see how these little bits of waste can really add up. The United States is the #1 trash-producing country in the world. If every country lived like the US, we'd need over 4 Earths to make all the stuff we consume.
Do you think little things make a big difference?
Totally. If you reduce single-use coffee cups from your routine and you're a daily coffee drinker, that's 365 cups per year. That's not an insignificant change. If every single person did that, that's a massive shift towards a more sustainable future.
And good policy can encourage this kind of shift. Take plastic bags. Americans throw away about 100 billion a year. But California is trying to change this. 3 communities have found that if you offer a plastic bag for free, 75% of people will take it. But if you charge 10 cents for a bag, only 16% take it. It's subtle, but this small fee makes people question whether they really need a bag, and it reminds people to bring their own. Communities across the country are beginning to adopt this policy, and it could create a large-scale shift. If New York City had a bag fee, we could save roughly 7 billion plastic bags a year. And without good policy, it can be really hard to do the right thing. So take recycling. In a place like Missoula, Montana, where I live, you can't recycle glass because doing so, it turns out, costs my city too much.
I think this is a fundamental flaw of governments and their relationship with businesses. Businesses aren't held accountable for products that they're putting into the waste stream. So they're allowed to sell glass in Montana where there's no adequate recycling and completely wipe their hands free and not have to subsidize any infrastructure to adequately recycle their product. So that responsibility for disposing of that product falls on you as a resident and the government. That is completely unfair.
The funny thing is, we used to have this really great system for dealing with glass. After you're done with a bottle, you would just return it. Companies would clean it and use it again and again. Around the 1950s, companies began experimenting with single-use bottles and cans. Lots of other things became single-use too. Like Don Draper here, people were just tossing their garbage wherever, and all this trash started to annoy people.
Do you remember that very famous commercial of this Native American? He's like going down a river and there's all this waste and a tear goes down.
People start pollution. People can stop it.
And it's often credited for quote-unquote cleaning up America because we were reminded that we need to pick up our trash.
You see this commercial every Earth Day, but it was actually funded by a group of companies, many of them from the can and bottle industry. They were worried that states would ban their single-use products because people were getting sick of all the trash.
So they created this incredible ad, which is very powerful, which made us pick up trash, which is actually trash that they were creating.
And selling to us,
Yeah,
and
and selling
profiting off of
it actually shifted. That was the moment. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't pick up trash, but as far as I can tell, it was the first moment where we shifted this responsibility from the person selling to the person buying.
That needs to change really quick. And once it does, we won't even have to talk about providing adequate recycling systems because businesses will create products that are easily and conveniently recyclable because it'll make more economic sense for them if that burden is put on the business instead of the consumer and the government.
This gets to the heart of the matter. Climate change is a giant problem. We're not going to solve it without government and industry taking action. We live in this complicated web of carbon emissions. I mean, every single thing we do as individuals creates pollution. It's overwhelming. But there's one simple policy that could make going green easier for all of us, and it could have an enormous impact. We could put a price on carbon. Right now, companies can emit as much pollution as they like. We're basically treating our sky like a giant sewer. As long as it's free to pollute, no one's going to stop doing it.
You can't just go out there and find one source or one factory, one business, and shut it down and clean up your air. Everybody, in a sense, is part of the problem.
If companies had to pay for the carbon they produce, it would encourage better behavior. This is what California did in 2006. The state set a cap on carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, and they lowered it over the next few years. Companies could either reduce their pollution or pay for carbon allowances. And so far, it's worked. The state is on track to hit its 2020 goal, and they're looking to cut emissions by another 40% by 2030. Now, California isn't perfect, but this is a huge reduction in emissions. It's really larger than anything a person could achieve on their own.
The fears that were raised by opponents have not come to pass. We've not seen an exodus of industries from California or people unable to drive their cars.
And as the state cut emissions, California's economy has actually grown by 12%, outpacing the national average. Going green at this scale isn't an overnight process. People like Mary Nichols have spent decades fighting for better policies.
We certainly have enjoyed a lot of political support from all sides. I think that's largely just because the public in California has demanded that clean, healthy air is something that everybody ought to have access to.
So individual climate action does matter in the sense that it creates cultural change. When Lauren makes a video tutorial or shares one of her zero waste tips on Instagram, it has a social ripple effect.
Do you want everyone to live the lifestyle you're living?
I would never tell anyone how to live their life. But I'd like to show everyone that there are options, that the way that we're told we have to live in this hyper-consumeristic way isn't the only way we have to live in order to live in a modern world with modern luxuries.
Folks like Lauren really help build the bottom-up support you need for large-scale transformation. Look, climate policy can be complicated and sometimes it can be boring, but we need it to solve global warming. And to get better policies, like a price on carbon, you need to have public support. Because politicians and businesses won't take action unless people come together and demand it. So you may
All right. So I do believe the stat was comparing it as a per person, right? How much individuals in each country are consuming. But I might be wrong, but the video is now 6 years old. So, keep that in mind that things do change quickly. But in terms of the general stats is developed countries like the United States and Europe and European countries per person consume much more, 10 to 100 times more than other countries per person. Okay, so things that you can do, right? Interesting discussion there on reducing consumption. And yes, I think California is still on track. And actually, one really interesting thing about California is California leads the rest of the United States because California is such a big economy. It's the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. So for example, car manufacturers, they look at California standards for air quality and miles per gallon in terms of fuel efficiency, and they make their vehicles based on that. So they don't follow the EPA per se, because they know California is such a large market that they want to be able to sell their vehicles in California. So yeah, California is really great in terms of being progressive with climate change and other things too. Okay, so the next question is, in the US, over the past few years, our carbon emissions have stopped rising. Are we consuming less? Yes, no? What do you think is happening? Why would our carbon emissions stop rising if we're not consuming less stuff? Yeah, outsourcing, or what we call exporting our emissions, okay? So as mentioned, we share the atmosphere. So it doesn't matter if the carbon comes from Russia, the carbon comes from China or India or the United States. That carbon is now in the atmosphere. It does matter in terms of policy making, right, to try to help each country lower their footprints. But what's happening now is that the United States, we're importing more goods. Manufactured goods are coming from other countries. And this is a research study about 13 years ago from a research scientist, or professor in the Earth System Science Department, Dr. Steve Davis, looking at the amount of emissions, right? So the really thick black lines here show that we are importing a significant amount of goods from China, right? So 1.4 gigatons per year of China's greenhouse gas emissions were because they were producing goods that ended up here in America, right? So this idea that we should start tracking where the emissions are coming from or where they're going, who's consuming, who's the end user, and maybe that party should be held responsible rather than the emitter, So there's a lot of policy, a lot of regulatory kind of principles here, and there's no perfect answer, but it's important to think about the big picture. All right, so the next thing we can do is efficiency. So we can conserve, demand less stuff, demand less goods. We can also be more efficient with the technologies we have, right? So technologies are increasing in efficiency. For example, modern appliances are much more energy efficient. And of course, we have to pause here and emphasize that not every person, not every family can afford to make those choices, right? So there has to be initiatives, there has to be resources available for the whole switch, right? To switch over to energy efficient appliances or more modern air conditioning units, et cetera. There has to be help for the folks that aren't able to do that, right? And we have to emphasize the inequities in the United States and of course across the world. So things like double paned, higher energy efficiency glass windows and water systems, right? Because all of that, right? You think, oh, why would water, taking a shorter shower or a more efficient shower stream? Because it uses energy to clean the water, right? Our water purification systems are very energy intensive. And then, of course, shipping, right? So one of the major issues with certain companies and their super fast shipping is that they're not as efficient because they're just trying to get the goods to you as soon as possible. If possible, you can opt for slower shipping, and that usually means they're more efficient in where and how they're getting those goods shipped around. Okay, so that's efficiency. Reducing the amount of energy we need for our goods and services. In America, we need serious improvements in our buildings, right? Temperature controls. When I was a graduate student at UCI, our laboratory was always so cold. I remember measuring the temperature once. It was like 63 degrees Fahrenheit in our lab, which is just way too cold, especially when people aren't in the rooms anymore. So we need to update our buildings. Also, our energy generation and electric grid in the United States is really old. Okay, some of our electrical grids and systems are as old as the idea of universal electricity, several 100+ years old. And so that's just not wise anymore when we have modern infrastructure and modern technology that can make all of these systems more efficient. Obviously, transportation is a huge source of carbon emissions, whether it's cars, trucks, shipping, also air transportation, right? There's been a big push to move and find alternative fuels for trucks as well as aircraft. And I just pulled this article from earlier this year about Airbus, the big manufacturer of commercial aircraft, that they're trying to figure out ways to move to hydrogen-powered planes because it would allow them bigger range and distance in their travels. Okay, so lots of research, right? So at UCI, we have the Fuel Cell Center. They're doing research on understanding how we can use fuel cell in vehicles and other things. Okay, so the next thing is carbon-free energy. So how do we get energy? Mainly, how are we going to make electricity in a way that is not producing carbon or methane as a byproduct? Okay, so really, how do we generate electricity? Our world is electrified. Everything we're doing is using electricity, but that electricity is coming from heat source, right? So we have some sort of system here. We're creating heat, whether that's burning fossil fuels, burning biomass, a nuclear reactor. However you're producing the heat, that heat creates steam. That steam turns turbines and creates electrical currents. How can we generate electricity without using non-renewable heat sources? Okay, well, the big ones are solar, right? Tons of sunlight. Solar is pretty good. We have hydroelectricity, hydroelectric, where moving water, running water can turn those turbines. Wind, same idea. The wind energy is turning that big turbine, creates electricity. Tidal, geothermal, and biomass. These are just some to name a few. There are many others that are in the works. Yeah, Samuel mentioned in the chat. And they're all very promising. Some are obviously very useful now. We don't have to wait 10, 15 years. For example, solar and wind are easy and becoming more cost effective and more affordable for folks. Okay, so as mentioned, nuclear, why nuclear is so useful is that it is creating a lot of heat. That that nuclear decay, the radioactive decay of those elements creates a lot of heat, and that is a nearly carbon-free way of producing electricity. There is some carbon in the beginning when you're setting up these nuclear reactors and then some maintenance, but in the grand scheme, they are way more carbon-free or carbon neutral than the other energy sources we're currently using now, which is fossil fuel and coal to create electricity. So thinking of how much of the fossil fuels we have and how much we've used, how much of the known fossil fuels on Earth have we already used up? All right. So many of you are saying about 75%. Well, here is a graph, and I'll admit it is older. It's about 11 years old now, but this is the most updated one I could find that shows the emissions so far of carbon from our oil, our gas, and coal. So the emissions to date are in purple. The estimated reserves we have are in blue, and the recoverable reserves, the ones that we could really go out and get, are in yellow. So you'll notice that oil, gas, and coal, these are the conventional forms of fossil fuel. We still have unconventional forms like oil and gas, like oil sands and tar sands. There's energy resources there. They're just not as cheap to get. And so we have not even really tapped the surface in terms of how much emissions we have from fossil fuels. So that's somewhat terrifying in the sense that, we still have at least 50 years left of oil. We have about 52 years left of natural gas and another 114 years left of coal reserves. So basically, we still have another 200 years or so of these reserves. So think of what we've done so far in 200 years, and that's what we could be in store for if we don't change our emissions and our technology. So why haven't we switched from fossil fuels? If we know that fossil fuels are creating carbon, putting carbon in the atmosphere, causing global warming, climate change, why haven't we switched from them yet? What is going on? Think about it and put your answer or your thoughts in chat. Give us about. So here we go. Cost money to standardize, establish, what world runs on it, and it's profitable. Money, lobbyist, profit. All right. All of that and more, right? So as mentioned, we have lots of fossil fuels. They're pretty readily accessible, and the infrastructure that we need to obtain, transport, refine them, get them into our cars and our buildings and our, electric grids or, electric generation stations it's there. We have it. And that's because 100+ years ago, our government, our society invested money, we call that subsidies, into supporting that tech. Because in the time, it was amazing, right? Of course, you have electricity in your homes now. So we invested our money in it. It's also on-demand power when we need it, right? So one of the cons of wind and solar is that it's not always available, right? For example, on really overcast days, I have solar on our house, and on overcast days, our solar production is lower, but we're still using electricity, right? So there are cons, and I will, admit that. I'm not trying to uh, hide anything, right? But we have ways around that. And that's going to be this idea of enhancing and restructuring our electric grids to be smart, right? We have machine learning, we have artificial intelligence, we have computers that can monitor where electricity is being produced in different areas in these micro regions, and we can move electricity where it needs to be more on demand. Of course, it was cheaper. It's been cheaper because we have had so much investment in the technology and in the infrastructure, but it's becoming less so. And especially if we start to put a price on carbon, put a tax on it, then fossil fuel related energy sources will become more expensive. And as mentioned, money, right? You can Google the corporate profits for the major oil companies each quarter. We're talking billions of dollars. And so then it becomes a question of, should companies that are making billions of dollars in profit still be subsidized by our government? Okay. And maybe that money that we're using for fossil fuels should be moving towards other resources, other fuel types. And so, for example, carbon-free energy, the cost of solar panels over time has greatly decreased. And this is looking at how much it costs per watt of energy produced. So even just about 10, 15 years ago, it was quite expensive and it has now decreased a lot. One, thinking about incentives, there is a big incentive now that was re-upped in the Inflation Reduction Act passed last year by Congress, where if you put solar panels on your house, you get 26% of that cost back when you file your taxes, right? So that's quite a bit of money. And other incentives and rebates in that infiltration, in Inflation Reduction Act to help folks move towards more sustainable energy sources, right? So if we look at the other types of renewable energy as compared to the cost of what we would consider traditional energy, like coal and nuclear in this graph, we can see that solar has decreased exceptionally down to about $68 per megawatt hour. And nuclear has gotten a bit more expensive too because of other issues in terms of a little bit of fear of nuclear fallout, nuclear failure. Coal hasn't really gotten much cheaper. And so we can see that wind, onshore wind, and our photovoltaic solar are now some of the cheapest ways to produce electricity. Okay, so that's those type of energies, right? Move to renewables. California is on track. California is leading the way. I talk about California all the time because now I live in Colorado. It's not as progressive here in terms of policies and climate change initiatives. But I know that I think it was starting this year in California, all new home builds have to have solar panels on them, which is fantastic, right? If it's there, people will use it. And I know that there's a lot of work going on in the United States with this Inflation Reduction Act that is supposed to help produce and create more electric vehicle charging stations across the US and things along that nature. So obviously the technology is there, it's getting better, but it's also about money and getting the infrastructure in place, right? Because for me, we have an EV car, an electric vehicle. One of the major concerns is, right, we can't take it forever because we will run out of electric charge. So we need those electric vehicle charging stations at good locations on our freeways. We need more of them. You can't just have one every few hundred miles because then everybody's waiting in line to charge their vehicles, right? So my process, my thought is, what if every gas station that we have now is required to have 3 or 4 electric vehicle charging stations? Because we know there's gas stations everywhere now, and then they could be converted as people are waiting 20 or 30 minutes to charge their cars, they would have, a little rest area. But I'm not president. Okay, so the next way is this idea of intervention, right? So that's mitigation, things that we can do to slow down or stop emissions. And now we have to think of ways that we can deal with the emissions that have already happened. So carbon capture and storage is the idea of capturing carbon, CO2 from the atmosphere, and then storing it deep in the earth again, kind of putting it back into the reservoir that it used to be in. Okay, so capture that carbon that was released by the burning of fossil fuels or the manufacturing of steel and cement, and then storing it underground in depleted oil gas reserves. Now, I will say here that this is not the end all be all. This process is energy intensive. It requires electricity. Is that electricity from fossil fuels or renewables, right? So you have to think about the whole picture. It's not the end all be all. It is an option to help us get to a carbon neutral, carbon negative drawdown scenario, but it's not what we should be doing by itself. So we'll watch this video demonstrating a little bit of the science behind it, what they're doing, and then we will keep talking about some other intervention techniques.
All of human activities at the moment, collectively each year, put about 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. Carbon removal now has to be thought of as part of Plan A for responding to climate change.
Here in British Columbia, we collect CO2 directly out of the atmosphere.
To some people, it seems like something that's way down the road, but the technology is ready for us to use now.
Climate change is a nasty thing, and it's going to take all of human ingenuity to get us through this moment. What we need to look at is if direct air capture is going to live up to its promise. It's much easier to keep a unit of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than it is to try and retrieve it once it's already there. So when it comes to climate change, the best way to respond is to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. In addition, scientists are suggesting the need to remove about 10 billion tons per year. That does have the ring of science fiction to it. Broadly speaking, there are two different categories of carbon removal strategies. One is a biological category, planting trees, changing farm practices, or you can, at the other end of the spectrum, imagine more technological or chemical-based strategies. Something like direct air capture, which would have been off the table a few decades ago as kind of a wacky scheme by mad scientists, now needs real consideration. But the economics and storage questions about whether carbon dioxide can actually be held over the long term, these are open questions.
So we're a carbon capture company. We have a pilot facility which captures a ton of CO2 per day. We think we're different because we're focused on very large scale.
There's different ways of attacking carbon capture. What we do is direct air capture, so we're targeting the low concentration CO2 that's in the atmosphere.
Fundamentally, our process has 4 steps. Each step concentrates the CO2 more. First step is a big fan. It pulls air through, it reacts with a chemical, and captures 80% of the CO2 out of the air.
We take that CO2-rich solution, we precipitate out solid calcium carbonate pellets.
We heat those very small pellets up, and out comes the CO2. You can then do 2 things with it. You can choose to permanently bury it somewhere safely. Now you've reduced the overall level of CO2, and that's carbon negative. Or you can make products out of it. One of the things we do here in Squamish is we combine our CO2 with hydrogen, and we make a fuel that's essentially carbon neutral. You put it in your car, you drive your car burns the CO2, and it goes back into the atmosphere again. And that's what carbon neutral means. You're not adding overall to the quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere.
If you think about a closed loop system, around and around we go. In time, though, there won't be enough to address climate change because the carbon dioxide has to be put into storage to actually remove the carbon dioxide from the atmospheric system. Direct air capture at the moment is a reasonably expensive proposition.
Industries fielded at scale, costs come down all the time. That's why as a company we focused on large scale, and why we're also happy to license our technology to anybody in the world who wants to build these plants. We just announced our first large-scale plant in Texas. We're actually expecting that will be a 1 megaton atmospheric CO2 plant. That's the equivalent of 40 million trees in one plant. Our cost point is a little bit less than $200 per ton for that first plant, but we expect the cost to come down a lot.
If carbon dioxide can be captured for $150 or less per ton, then it becomes almost a commercially viable enterprise because that carbon dioxide could be put to a use that would enable the facility to pay for itself. But to scale it up would mean building lots and lots of these facilities and spreading them around the world.
You could eliminate the world's emissions with 40,000 of our plants. Sounds like a big number, but it's actually less than there are power plants, for example, in the world.
Lots of grand promises have been made about carbon removal, and one of the jobs that has to be done now is to sort through the reality from the promise. The goal is to use large-scale carbon removal as a piece of humanity's response. But if society kind of gets the notion that there's a get-out-of-jail-free card, then that might have perverse impacts on climate response today. So the trick now is to work out what forms of carbon removal at what scales are going to make the best contribution and the most socially just contribution.
We think of ourselves as a really important tool that we have to have in the fight against climate change. I don't think it should be the only solution, but we need everything we can bring to the table.
All right, so that's carbon capture and storage, right? As mentioned many times throughout that, it's not the only tool we should be using. And I do know that recently, yes, one of the plants in Texas and I think Florida is starting to become operational. But again, it uses energy to do that. So we have to make sure that the whole system is using carbon-free energy to be really benefiting our planet. So that's carbon capture and storage. And then the last intervention is this idea of geoengineering, manipulating and kind of intervening the Earth system to counteract some of the human-induced climate change. And there's two basic approaches. We have the carbon dioxide removal, which we already mentioned, the air capture aspect of bringing some of the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And then there's the idea of solar radiation management. So impacting the amount of incoming sunlight the Earth receives through changing the reflectivity, the albedo, or kind of what's in the atmosphere. For example, putting more aerosols in the stratosphere to help with reflection, kind of that idea of more volcanic eruptions, right? That's what they're doing is when there's a volcanic eruption, you get little pieces of particles and reflective aerosols in the stratosphere reflecting incoming sunlight. Okay, so here are a few. Again, we have ocean fertilization, afforestation, air capture, desert surface albedo, stratospheric aerosol, space reflector. Thinking of the issue of ocean acidification, which one of these geoengineering techniques would help prevent increased ocean acidification? All right, so the problem of ocean acidification stems from the fact that there is more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then that increases the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean, and then impacts the pH or the acidity. So the only solution here that would reduce the amount of CO2 would be one of these carbon dioxide removal techniques. And in this case, on the list I gave you would be afforestation, which is planting more trees on large scales to help remove carbon dioxide. Now, there's a caveat to this afforestation. It sounds great, but there are pros and cons. And one of the cons is if you plant trees, that could impact the global albedo because trees are, a different color than some surfaces. And so you have to be very careful and thoughtful about this afforestation process. Okay, so the answer here was afforestation. Okay, so for a little bit, I just want to talk about pollution and human health because it's one thing to talk about the planet. The planet's going to be fine. I mean, like it's been here longer than us and it will be here well beyond us. But what matters is that there's people on this planet and human activity has impacted air quality, water quality, and that has direct impacts on humans and our health. Okay, so I'd like to take a moment to talk about that and to think about how we can, make a better planet and also help people and our health. Okay, so the idea of environmental science and conservation really was a push, a movement in the 1950s. And this came around the publication or release of this book called Silent Spring. If you're into the environmental science movement, you're going to be an environmental scientist or what have you, this is a must read, okay? This is a book written by Rachel Carson. It was the first of its kind to really highlight human activities' impact on the natural world, on ecosystems. And in 1950s, this book came out, and then it was several decades later, not until the 1970s, that the US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, was formed and then started to have a response to certain chemicals in our environment. One of those chemicals is DDT, which I have a video here and we'll discuss what that means. Yeah, so this is a really impactful book. It really led the movement. So the idea of environmental science and conservation is not something that's been around for, forever. It's only really been, the last 60, 70 years. Okay, so let's watch this little mini documentary about Rachel Carson and how she helped change a really big field.
In 1958, Rachel Carson received a letter describing songbirds suddenly dropping from tree branches. The writer blamed their deaths on a pesticide called DDT that exterminators had sprayed on a nearby marsh. The letter was the push Carson needed to investigate DDT. She had already heard from scientists and conservationists who were worried that rampant use of the pesticide posed a threat to fish, birds, and possibly humans. She began to make inquiries through government contacts from her years working in the United States Bureau of Fisheries. She asked, what has already silenced the voices of spring? In 1962, Carson published her findings in Silent Spring. Her book documented the misuse of chemicals and their toll on nature and human health. Silent Spring immediately drew both applause and impassioned dissent, along with vicious personal attacks on the author. How did this mild-mannered biologist and writer ignite such controversy? Carson began her career as a hard-working graduate student, balancing her studies in biology at Johns Hopkins University with part-time jobs. Still, she had to leave school before completing her doctorate to provide for her ailing father and sister. Carson found part-time work with the Bureau of Fisheries, writing for a radio program on marine biology. Her ability to write materials that could hold the general public's attention impressed her superiors, and in 1936, she became the second woman to be hired at the Bureau full-time. In 1941, she published the first of 3 books on the ocean, combining science with lyrical meditations on underwater worlds. These explorations resonated with a wide audience. In Silent Spring, Carson turned her attention to the ways human actions threaten the balance of nature. DDT was originally used during World War II to shield crops from insects and protect soldiers from insect-borne diseases. After the war, it was routinely sprayed in wide swaths to fight pests, often with unforeseen results. One attempt to eradicate fire ants in the southern U.S. killed wildlife indiscriminately, but did little to eliminate the ants. In spite of this and other mishaps, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and chemical companies extolled the benefits of DDT. There was little regulation or public awareness about its potential harm, but Carson showed how the overuse of chemicals led to the evolution of resistant species, which, in turn, encouraged the development of deadlier chemicals. Since DDT does not dissolve in water, she asserted that over time, it would accumulate in the environment. The bodies of insects, the tissues of animals who consume those insects, and eventually humans. She suggested that exposure to DDT might alter the structure of genes with unknown consequences for future generations. The response to Silent Spring was explosive. For many people, the book was a call to regulate substances capable of catastrophic harm. Others objected that Carson hadn't mentioned DDT's role controlling the threat insects posed to human health. Former Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson demanded to know why a spinster with no children was so concerned about genetics, and dismissed Carson as probably a communist. A lawyer for a pesticide manufacturer alluded to Carson and her supporters as sinister influences, aiming to paint businesses as immoral. In reality, Carson had focused on the dangers of chemicals because they weren't widely understood, while the merits were well publicized. She rejected the prevailing belief that humans should and could control nature. Instead, she challenged people to cultivate maturity and mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. Carson died of cancer in 1964, only 2 years after the publication of Silent Spring. Her work galvanized a generation of environmental activists. In 1969, under pressure from environmentalists, Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act that required federal agencies to evaluate environmental impacts of their actions. To enforce the act, President Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. And in 1972, the EPA issued a partial ban on the use of DDT. Long after her death, Rachel Carson continued to advocate for nature through the lingering impact of her writing. Taking a stand in the name of truth is no easy task. For another impressive tale of strong conviction and good science, check out this video.
Okay, so as mentioned in the video there, her main focus was on DDT and different insecticides and pesticides that were not being broken down in the environment. So DDT at the time was marketed as safe, but what is known as a bioaccumulating chemical, which means it's not broken down in the water, it's not broken down by other chemical reactions. So it accumulates in the bodies of organisms and moves its way up the food chain. So it led to reproductive effects in humans and animals. In 1972, the EPA banned it or partially banned its use, so there were still some usages of it, but it's persistent. It's a persistent chemical in our environment, so it's still a concern. So these persistent chemicals become problems. So here's like a little, magazine advertisement for DDT in the 60s. And so this led us to introducing some new policies. So the EPA was founded, and then immediately after, the Clean Air Act was written and established. That started in 1970 and was amended in 1977 and recently in 1990. And I say recently, it's 30 years ago, but impactful. And sets that the EPA is required to regulate emissions of pollutants that, quote, endanger public health and welfare. And in 2007, Supreme Court ruled that global warming emissions are considered air pollutants, but recently the Supreme Court said that CO2 cannot be regulated as a pollutant, which is somewhat interesting. But anyway, the Clean Air Act is set to regulate certain pollutants. So there are 6 criteria pollutants that the EPA regulates and monitors, and those are ground level ozone, lead, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and carbon monoxide. And so the EPA sets standards that cities and states must meet. If they do not meet these standards, they are fined, which, money is money, but people's health is more important. For example, Colorado is often not meeting the standard for ground level ozone because Colorado gets a lot of pollution from the West Coast, and it makes its way here and then causes issues. So again, we share an atmosphere. So what's happening in one city or one state is not localized. It will make its way around. Okay, so ground level ozone. So this is different from the ozone that's high up in the stratosphere that protects us from ultraviolet radiation. This is ozone that is formed near Earth's surface where humans are living, and it's formed from the reaction of sunlight with other pollutants, pollutants that are coming typically from vehicles and vehicle exhaust. And it's a health hazard because it can actually impact our lungs and our skin and our tissues and cause breathing issues. And it can be seen to cause damage in plants. So here's an example of a leaf, same plant. You can see all of the yellowing and the black spots. That is a plant that has been exposed to high levels of ground ozone. So the plants stop being able to photosynthesize as efficiently and can die. And it also destroys rubber. Okay, so one of the ways we found out that ozone, ground level ozone, was a thing is that in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, all the cars in LA were having issues with their rubber tires cracking and breaking. And it was the ozone. It will react and destroy rubber. So just kind of a fun fact. Then there's lead. Okay, so the reason that you see, if you go to get gasoline, you see it say unleaded, is because at one point in time it was leaded gasoline. And the reason for that is the lead, addition of the lead to the gasoline was thought to help make it more stable, less volatile, less ability to just kind of combust, which, you know, is what you want in a car when you're driving around with your family. It was also readily used in industry and in paints. So if you've ever lived in a building that was built before 1978, oftentimes you have to sign a waiver stating or acknowledging that at some point in time, maybe lead paint was used in that house, but now it is not lead paint. Lead is a heavy metal and it's toxic and it can accumulate in humans, causes serious health effects, and infants and young children are especially sensitive to the impacts of lead because their bodies are growing and developing so fast. Most young children are tested for lead at the age of 1 to see if you're exposed, because sometimes you won't even know that you're being exposed to lead pollution. And because it is a heavy metal, it is persistent in our environment. So this idea of persistent chemicals is where we're focusing because it is not easily removed. So here is the lead air quality. This is from the EPA showing in 1990 up until 2015, the impacts of monitoring for lead in the atmosphere through the EPA. We can see that lead has rapidly decreased, partly due to the fact that, you know, in 1996, gasoline became fully unleaded in the United States, at least. Then we have nitrogen oxides, or what's known as NOx. So nitrogen oxides, NO, and then X. So nitric oxide, NO, and NO2, nitrogen dioxide, are chemicals released usually from the incomplete combustion process, mainly through vehicle exhaust. And these compounds in the atmosphere contribute to smog, so air pollution, like we think of smog and the haziness of LA, also contributes to acid rain and the formation of ground level ozone. So if you reduce the amount of NOx, you'll also impact the amount of ozone. And yeah, so you can get acid rain, which is not great. And so we can see the difference in, this is in the bottom panel, the amount of nitrate deposited on the Earth's surface in 1988 as compared to 2008. So we do see a rapid decrease in the amount due in part to the Clean Air Act. Then we have sulfur dioxide, SO2. So sulfur dioxide is released from the burning of coal and through different oil refinery processes. Sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere can react to form particulate matter, and we'll get to that here in a second. Sulfur dioxide obviously has other issues, health effects too, like respiratory system. It can cause environmental issues with harming trees and plants by damaging their foliage and creating haze. And the big thing here is that sulfur dioxide is really good at creating acid rain. So SO2, just like CO2, reacts with water to create an acid. And so if we look at the pH, the acidity of rainfall, and this is in 1994 on the top left, and then on the bottom right, it's 2008, we can see that the eastern side of the United States has decreased a lot in the reds. Okay, so the pH has become more basic. It's still somewhat acidic, and that's to be seen because there is different compounds in the air that help to make the air, water slightly acidic. But we do see that a lot of the super acidic, less than 4.3 on the pH scale, in parts of Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio have decreased quite a bit. So that's great. Acid rain causes problems, as mentioned, for plants, buildings, because it can eat away at the infrastructure and the rock material. Then there's carbon monoxide, okay? Obviously, carbon monoxide, you've probably heard of it. You probably have a carbon monoxide monitor in your home. If not, you should, because it is a silent killer. You can't smell it, can't see it, and at high concentrations, it can lead to death. CO, carbon monoxide in our atmosphere, is mainly from the combustion of fossil fuels. It's a byproduct of the combustion process, which is why you should never, absolutely never, run a combustion engine inside. That means if you have a garage, always open your garage door before you turn on a combustion vehicle or a generator, right? So during the big snowstorm that impacted Texas a few years ago, some of the deaths from that storm resulted from people running generators inside. And then they poisoned themselves with carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide, one of our criteria pollutants, and its level in the atmosphere has decreased a lot. Oops, wait a minute. Why is this out of order? I want to move these. Okay, we'll come, well, yeah, okay, well, I'll pause there for a second. There's one more criteria pollutant, and we'll get to it in a second. We'll actually get to it when we get back from break. I just want to finish this up really quick here is after the Clean Air Act, there was the Clean Water Act in 1972, so 2 years later. And why is that the Cuyahoga River in Ohio was catching on fire in the 1800s and early 1900s. Okay, it had caught on fire 13 times. So think about that. Water, a river, catching on fire because of the amount of pollution from manufacturing and refineries that was just being dumped into the water. The blaze in 1952 caused over $1 million in damages, and the 1969 fire shown here kind of became the symbol of out of control water pollution. And so the Clean Water Act states and regulates discharges of pollutants into waters and sets standards for what can be found in waters, right? So monitoring what's in the water, and it makes it unlawful to discharge any pollutant from a point source unless a permit is obtained. So there is a caveat there that some organizations and companies can still pollute stuff into the water, which leads me to this, which is a recent documentary. I say recent, I think it's like 3 years old now, but recent documentary that you may have seen on Netflix called The Devil We Know. There's also a dramatized movie starring Mark Ruffalo and Anne Hathaway called Dark Waters. And this is about industries polluting our waters and our waterways to this day. This one is about DuPont and the Teflon situation. So the C8s, the different chemicals that were used to create the nonstick surfaces in the 1970s and 80s. I'm not going to go into details here about all the many thousands of different pollutants that are in our waters, but I'll just say that many chemicals, especially those that are proprietary, meaning these companies have created them, they're human-made synthetic chemicals. Oftentimes, the EPA allows companies to self-regulate what is a safe discharge level or what is a safe amount of these in water and air, because the EPA doesn't have the information because they're proprietary, right? These companies aren't going to sell their money-making compounds, just not going to give that information out. So there are some issues still with that type of self-regulation. Any company that self-regulates usually ends up in trouble. For example, Boeing recently with their self-regulation and their MCAS air system that caused airplanes to crash and people to die. So yeah, anyway, Clean Water Act, in theory is great, but there are still kind of exceptions and ways to work around it. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. We're going to take a break. And when we return, we'll talk about particulate matter and then a success story in terms of humans and our environment. So let's return at 2:55. Yeah, I'll see you at 2:55. All right, so we'll finish up here talking about air pollution, then we'll move into our success story. So the last criteria pollutant that is monitored and regulated by the EPA is particulate matter, or PM. And particulate matter is defined as the sum of all solid and liquid particles that are suspended in the air. And this could be things like dust, dirt, soot, smoke. Can also be particles from construction sites, smokestacks, fires, etc. And we break particulate matter into two size categories. PM10 means any particulate matter that is 10 micrometers or smaller. So what does that mean? Well, 5 PM10 molecules, particles, would fit across the human hair width. Okay, so these are really small particles. PM 2.5 are obviously even smaller. These are particles that are less than 2.5 micrometers in diameter. And you could put 4 of those PM 2.5s across one PM10. And we're concerned about all of these, but more so with PM 2.5 because they are so small, these combustion particles, that they are inhalable. We can actually inhale them, and all of the defensive designs of our body, like mucus and saliva, all that, those particles are still small enough that they can bypass all of those barriers and make their way deep into our lungs. Okay, so PM10, most of those particulate matter particles only make it into the upper respiratory tract. They get filtered out by our body. Anything smaller can start to make it into our lower respiratory tract, and even very fine particles, PM 0.1, can make it into our bloodstream. And so that can have huge implications for health and mortality. In the mid-90s, this study came out called the Harvard 6-City Study. Okay, so I want us to look at this. Each one of these letters on the graph is a different city. It's an abbreviated, the letter for the name of the city. On the x-axis is the amount of particulate matter of 2.5 micrometers or less measured in that city. So cleaner cities are found on the left and dirtier cities are found on the right. The vertical axis is the rate ratio, which is a way that the researchers were able to calculate how people's lives were impacted. Okay, so a rate ratio of less than 1 means there was no observable impact in the lives of these folks in terms of their life expectancy. Anything above 1 of a rate ratio means the scientists observed shorter life expectancy, shorter lives in some of these cities. So take a moment, look at this data, this real data, and tell me, what does the figure show us? What is it telling us about particulate matter and life expectancy? Right. So the dirtier, the more polluted a city is, the shorter life expectancy the researchers found. Okay? So there was a correlation here. And this study is called An Association Between Air Pollution and Mortality in 6 US Cities. It was published in 1993, and the last time I checked, it was cited over 4,000 or nearly 5,000 times. And what they found was that people that live in dirtier cities, and dirtier is in reference to the amount of particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less, were dying younger than those in clean cities. And their strongest correlation was found with the particulate matter of 2.5. So this is a groundbreaking study. They recently went back and studied more, it's now 30 years old, and looked at, these are long studies. They're tracking and following people for decades of their lives and trying to figure out if air pollution impacts their livelihood. And it is now shown that it does. What is also a little troublesome is that the dirty cities, what's considered here dirty on my graph, we're still within the EPA standards for what is an acceptable level of PM 2.5 pollution. So it's likely, and many people argue, that the EPA standards are too high, meaning that we need to lower what is acceptable because air pollution is still too high and it's impacting people's health. So you don't want to be around 2.5 p.m. So when there's forest fires and things of that nature, you wear those masks that we have lying around from COVID, because they actually do help with that filtration. And even more recently, this is from 2022, the World Health Organization released this kind of breaking statement that billions of people who are breathing on our planet are breathing unhealthy air. And their findings suggested that nearly the whole entire population of the planet, 99%, breathe air that exceeds the World Health Organization of air quality limits and threatens their health. Okay, so we need to clean up our air. And one way we can do that, right, is by not using fossil fuels anymore, using more electrical vehicles and vehicles of renewable energy sources, because they do not release particulate matter into the atmosphere. So just a few air pollution cases. So LA is notorious for, infamous for its air pollution in the 60s and 70s, or 50s, 60s, and 70s. And here are some photos of what it looked like driving through LA and up to LAX airport. Folks were, wearing these really large and kind of terrifying masks because air quality was so bad. What was happening is this yellow-brown haze was produced, which we call smog, was produced by the reaction of the sunlight with our car exhaust and exhaust particles, which we now know to be those nitrogen oxide particles. And so we were basically producing ozone. So that haziness is the ozone particles. Eventually, we discovered that all of this pollution was being generated because of the dirty combustion in the vehicles. And so catalytic converters were put on cars to help with cleaning them up. And it helped reduce the tailpipe emissions from vehicles. And so this catalytic converter became required as of 1975 and greatly increased air quality in the LA area, as well as many other areas across the United States and the world. So that's why we have catalytic converters on cars. You don't have catalytic converters on EV cars. So fun fact, there's a lot of theft recently of catalytic converters because they have a lot of metals that are worth money in them. And I was really nervous about it in my neighborhood. And then I remembered I have electric vehicles, so I don't have any catalytic converters. So don't have to worry about that. Other case studies, right? So in the 1950s in London, which if you watch The Crown, the show about the royal family on Netflix, they actually portrayed this event in that show, but it was the Great Smog of 1952. It actually was produced by sulfur dioxide. It was heavy use of coal, of burning coal, produced a lot of sulfur dioxide, and the air was very stagnant. There wasn't a lot of mixing of fresher air, and the air just kind of hovered in that area. It lasted for about 4 days in the early December period, and they call these pea supers. I had to look this up because I didn't understand it, but the air was so thick, it reminded people of pea soup. So just thick, stagnant, thick air. It's estimated that about 4,000 people died from this pollution. But more recent estimates, going back and looking at records, suggest that that number may be more like 10 to 12,000 deaths. Okay, so air pollution kills. And over 100,000 people were made ill from the smog during that 4-day event. So it matters. In more recent times, the burning of peat in Indonesia for the lucrative palm oil plantations has led to extreme levels of particulate matter pollution, that PM 2.5, which we know can kill. It can reduce your life expectancy. And so you can see these young children here wearing masks, and pretty sophisticated masks, just at school. And it's an unfortunate reality of, an economic driver for burning this region to grow palm oil. And then more local into California is the Salton Sea. Okay, so the Salton Sea is a recent and ongoing air pollution issue. What happened is there was this basin, a geologic basin in this area that was accidentally, inadvertently, filled in 1905 by some engineers when they were trying to direct some Colorado River water. And they filled up this basin, and it became what is known as the Salton Sea. The issue is that the only source of water to the Salton Sea is through runoff from the Imperial Valley. So it's very farming intensive region. There's a lot of fertilizer and other types of pollution in the water. All of that leads to super contaminated and super salty waters from the runoff. And then the only way the water is leaving is through evaporation. So that also increases the salinity. So evaporation is causing the salinity to be about 2 times higher than the ocean salinity, and it's killing a lot of fish species and a lot of wildlife. In 2018, some of the water that was being diverted or going into the Salton Sea to keep the lake level at a certain height was stopped because water is obviously very precious, especially in California, which has allowed the lake, the Salton Sea, to start drying up and leaving behind those toxic metals, the fertilizer, the DDT, the pesticides that have accumulated in the bottom of that lake. Okay, and so we have zinc, lead, pesticides, chromium, all types of pollutants in the Salton Sea. And dust storms in the Coachella Valley are responsible for about 70% of the air pollution there, and a lot of that dust is coming from the Salton Sea. Okay, so it's an air pollution issue in modern day. And there's also the Great Salt Lake. So just similar to the Salton Sea, with less precipitation, the Great Salt Lake is drying up, and dust in the lake contains naturally occurring arsenic and other heavy metals. And when the lake is drying up, those particles can then be blown around during wind events, during weather events. We're not sure how long it's going to last, but this is a pollution issue for folks in and around the Salt Lake, or not Salt, yeah, the Great Salt Lake, and then east of the Salt Lake. So here in Colorado, because that jet stream picks up all of that dust and brings it to the east. So these are modern day air pollution issues. And so air pollution kills, okay? It's a silent killer. Every year, about 7 million deaths are caused by exposure to both outdoor air pollution as well as indoor air pollution. We think that our air inside is very clean, and oftentimes it's more polluted than our outdoor air because of things like cooking stoves. So natural gas stoves are actually well known to produce a lot of indoor air pollution. Okay, and it's not equal, okay, in terms of who's getting impacted by air pollution. And we know that air pollution is really harmful for pregnant women and for young children. And so we need to clean up our air to help everybody. And as mentioned, air pollution is not equal. Okay, so the people of color bear greater air pollution burden. So when we look at these type of graphs, it shows the proportional particulate matter burden for populations that identify as non-white. Okay, so in this study out of the American Journal of Public Health in 2018, it showed that non-white people face higher exposure to particulate matter in all but 4 states. So most of the states in the United States, the non-white people, non-white citizens are seen and exposed to more of this particulate matter pollution than white people. And there's just not enough time to go into the reasons for all that, but a lot of it stems from systemic racial issues in terms of where people live and what type of jobs different communities have. And this one was another more recent 2019 study that shows the inequity in consumption of goods and services adds to air pollution disparities. So this shows on the left the PM levels, particulate matter levels from different factors or different industries that groups of people are exposed to. So Black folks exposed to the highest level of particulate matter due to things like passenger vehicles, residential, agriculture, construction, airplanes, while white or other are exposed to the lesser amount of particulate matter pollution. But then when you look at the particulate matter pollution that each of those categories of identities caused, we find that Hispanic and Black communities are actually causing much less of the particulate matter pollution than white or other. So non-white people cause less air pollution, but are unfortunately and systemically exposed to more of it. So this comes down to this idea of equity in terms of climate change and climate change solutions. So there are many solutions to help reduce air pollution. They're listed here, right? Building safe and affordable public transit systems and investing in energy efficient power generation and grids, to name just a few. All right. So with air pollution cleanup, we have to use the scientific method to figure out how to go about changing a problem. So first we have to recognize the problem. Okay, so in the 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s, we recognized that there was a problem with the smog in LA. We unraveled the scientific process, for example, why and how the ozone was forming near the ground. We got policy involved, and we did something, and we're going to keep track, right? One of the things is you can't just let go and say we're done here. We have to make sure that we're keeping our word in terms of carbon emissions or the things that we said we're going to do. So my story here is a success story. This is not about air pollution per se. It's about a greater threat. So we're going to talk about stratospheric ozone. So ozone and ozone, they're the same chemical, 3 oxygens. But high up in the stratosphere, we are forming ozone because our little oxygen molecules, or molecular oxygens, O2s, are getting hit by ultraviolet sunlight. And that super powerful high frequency energy of the ultraviolet sunlight can break those molecular oxygens into single oxygen molecules. But those don't like to be by themselves, so they quickly combine to form O3. Okay, so my little molecular oxygens with the single oxygens, they boom, 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 get together, and we have O3. Okay, so that is our reaction high up in the stratosphere. And so if we measure the amount of we measure the amount of ozone above our heads, it would look something like this line here, whereas we are starting at the surface at 0 kilometers, and we move up to 10, 15, 20 kilometers above our head, we would see a maximum in ozone around 20 kilometers above our head. That's the stratosphere. That is just where that chemical reaction is taking place. That is our ozone layer. And we've touched on this a bit, and you may already have knowledge about this, that the stratospheric ozone layer protects us at the surface from the harmful ultraviolet UV light that can damage our cells, our skin cells, it can damage our eyes. It's also harmful to plants and animals as well. And so our ozone layer protects us from all of the UVC. It's a bandwidth, a range of the light, all of it. It protects us from all of that. It protects us from a lot, the majority of the UVB, but it doesn't protect us from the UVA. It's just due to the properties of that molecule. And so when you wear sunscreen, which in Southern California, you should be wearing sunscreen every day, at least on your face, so you don't age. We'll say, full spectrum or UVA, UVB. It's going to protect you from that range of wavelength. So just really quickly, some units. If we took all of the ozone in a column of air above our head and compressed it down to atmospheric pressure down at the surface, all of the ozone that's protecting us from that ultraviolet light would form a slab that's about 3 millimeters thick. 3 millimeters thick. That's it. 3 millimeters thick. It's hardly anything. Okay, it's hard to see. There's my ruler. Hardly anything, but it's very important. So 300 Dobson units, just a unit of measurement for ozone, corresponds to that 3 millimeter thickness. In the early 1900s, there was this guy, he's an engineer, named Thomas Midgley. He invented the idea of leaded gasoline, which we just talked about, because he thought and proposed that it would be more stable and safe. He also invented these compounds called chlorofluorocarbons, also known as CFCs. And these CFCs were great at the time because they were very stable compounds that were designed to replace more dangerous compounds in people's homes. Okay? I'm going to pause here and just say, don't be a Thomas Midgley. So this poor guy, he actually invented and encouraged society to use two pretty awful techniques or molecules. And unfortunately, both of these have not been good for our society. But CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, these are non-toxic synthetic chemicals. They're non-reactive. They're not flammable. They don't blow up on people. And these were really great because they could replace dangerous and toxic gases like ammonia. So ammonia was used in the early days as a refrigerant. So how does your refrigerator stay cold? There's a refrigerant in it, same way that your air conditioner works. And the CFCs replace that. Okay, so that's great because we don't want things blowing up in our kitchen when we're trying to cook some pasta, okay? But non-reactive substances cannot be easily removed or destroyed in our Earth system. They're non-reactive. Things don't eat them, things don't break them down. There aren't chemical reactions really in your system. And so things like DDT, the CFCs, and then Teflon, as I mentioned, these are persistent chemicals in our Earth system. So in the 50s, we're rapidly using those CFCs in our daily lives because they're awesome. They're replacing those more dangerous chemicals. In the 1970s, at two different universities, the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and the University of California, Irvine in Irvine, scientists were looking at how chlorine, this molecule chlorine, could impact ozone. Okay, so scientists, chemistry, they just like to do random sometimes experiments. But these folks, they had kind of seen the increase in chlorine from the chlorofluorocarbons. So there's chlorine in those chlorofluorocarbons. That's what the chloro is, chlorine. And so they wanted to start to see, hey, is this going to be bad if we put a bunch of chlorine containing compounds into the atmosphere? Well, the publication from Ralph Cicerone and his group showed that chlorine can destroy ozone. And then at the same time, Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina at UCI, they figured out and determined that the chlorine from the CFCs themselves could destroy ozone. So this is in 1974. You might recognize the name Cicerone because Cicerone Field, the baseball field at UCI, is named after Ralph Cicerone. At one point in time, he was the chancellor of the university. So Rowland Hall, you may have seen it on campus. It's a pretty important one, chemistry building, named after Sherry Rowland, who passed away in 2012. but was very impactful for policy and using knowledge, scientific knowledge to impact policy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. Around the same time that Mario Molina, Ralph Cicerone, and the folks were looking at laboratory-based measurements, scientists in Antarctica were also measuring the amount of ozone over Antarctica. Okay, so this is the 1985 paper that showed that there was large losses or a large decline in the amount of ozone over Antarctica. Okay, so you can measure the amount of ozone, you can send an instrument, shoot it, kind of send it up, not send the whole instrument, but point it towards the atmosphere, and you can use different techniques to measure the amount of ozone. Again, here's our Dobson unit. So 300 Dobson units is kind of like a healthy amount of ozone. And they noticed that the amount of ozone was steadily dropping to below 200 Dobson units. Okay, and so they were like, what is causing this rapid decline of Antarctic ozone? And around the same time in 1983, the first satellite image of that Antarctic ozone hole was discovered. So it's not really a hole, okay? There's not like missing, there's not like totally no ozone there. It should be more like a thinning patch or a balding patch, if you want to think of it like that, just less. Okay, but hole is a little bit more ominous, and it actually helped get people on board with, action. So here it's showing the amount of ozone. The darker blues are more ozone, the orange is less. Okay, so this is our thinning hole of ozone over Antarctica. At the same time, a little later, maybe a year later, Dr. Susan Solomon led a group of scientists to measure the amount of chlorine over Antarctica during winter, which is tough because Antarctica gets dark and very cold, 24 hours of darkness in the winter. But during the winter, the really strong polar jet stream sets up where we have those really strong winds that are circulating around Antarctica. And what that does is it actually traps air in and over Antarctica, that it doesn't interact with air over the middle latitudes or the tropics. Okay, so her group, they wanted to go in and measure in the middle of winter to see really, is there something going on? Because we still couldn't figure out why it was happening over Antarctica. Okay, and so here are some of the measurements that were made. I'm going to help you with this, but we want to orient ourselves. The x-axis is latitude. So as you go from 64 degrees south to the right, you're moving more south to 70 degrees south, closer to the South Pole. The black line is the amount of chlorine monoxide, so chlorine that was measured. And the blue line is the amount of ozone that was measured. So take a moment, read this graph. Based on the data obtained, what conclusion can be drawn? All right. So what was discovered was with these co-measurements, these simultaneous measurements of both compounds, we were able to draw a conclusion, and that is that when when chlorine monoxide levels were higher, the ozone levels were dropping. And this confirmed what was already known in the laboratory, right, from UCI and University of Michigan, is that chlorine can destroy ozone. So more chlorine, less ozone. Okay, and so high chlorine leads to low ozone. How exactly was this happening? The thought process is that over Antarctica, and why was it really over Antarctica instead of, the mid latitudes? It has something to do with temperature. So over Antarctica, it gets super duper duper cold. We're talking about minus 80, minus 100 degrees Celsius in the atmosphere. And these polar stratospheric clouds can form in those temperatures, okay? So they're super high up. They are very, very cold, and they provide a surface, these ice particles, for different chemical reactions to take place. Okay, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty here. Just know that you need those ice particles for chemistry to happen. Boom, the magic happens. And what happens is that the chemistry allows for the chlorofluorocarbons to break open, break apart, and allow those chlorines to hang out. Okay, we need the chlorines by themselves. We get the chlorine-free radicals, and in early spring over Antarctica, once the sunlight starts to peek through in October, September, October, there is a rapid destruction of ozone. Those free chlorines that were hanging out on the ice crystals are attacking the ozone in the presence of sunlight. The polar stratospheric clouds aren't fully understood. We're still researching them. Obviously, they're hard to research. You have to be in very cold, extreme environments, but this is kind of the theory, the well-accepted theory for how ozone depletion was occurring. Okay, so great. 1985, scientists and policymakers get together at the Vienna Convention to protect the ozone layer. And then 2 years later, the Montreal Protocol is signed, okay? And this protocol phased out all of the substances, phased out the production of these substances that were known to destroy ozone. So here is the New York Times article for Thursday, September 17th, 1987. Dozens of nations reach agreement to protect ozone. Okay, so in the 70s, 1974, Sherry Rowland and Ralph Cicerone, they were actually really good friends. They, discovered this chlorine issue, but it took another 13 years for international agreement to take place. So here are some of the substances that have been banned by the Montreal Protocol. We are still measuring them. We are still monitoring their abundance in the atmosphere because we want to make sure that no one is starting to produce them again, for example. But I want you to look at CFC 11 and CFC 12. We stopped producing them globally really around the mid-1990s. Why have their levels not declined very fast, even though we're no longer producing and using these compounds? What do you think? Right. So this idea of lifetime, right? We talked about the residence time of a carbon molecule in the atmosphere. These compounds have what we call an atmospheric lifetime, or you could think of it as a residence time of how long the chemical stays in the atmosphere or the system before it's destroyed or removed. So they are stable and non-reactive, but eventually they do react over a very long time. So a molecule of CFC11 stays in the atmosphere for about 52 years. A molecule of CFC12 stays in the atmosphere about 102 years. So a molecule that was released of CFC12 in 1990 will still be around well into my whole lifetime, and most of yours too. And so this is the concept I really want to point out here, is that just like carbon dioxide, we're not going to see a turnover immediately if we stop emitting or reduce our emissions of CO2, because the atmospheric lifetime of CO2 is decades, hundreds of years. It just depends on where the CO2 is emitted. Is it close to land? Is it by the water, et cetera? But that doesn't mean we're not doing something good. Okay? So our ozone hole is recovering. It takes time, okay, because these compounds live for a long time. It's anticipated that by basing, how much we emitted and when we intervened, we anticipate that the ozone layer over Antarctica will reach 1980 level, like what it was before we kind of messed it up, around 2050 or 2060. So in another 30 to 40 years. Okay? So the Montreal Protocol is a beautiful story of a win for our planet. Okay, if we look at how much chlorine could have been in our atmosphere and available to destroy ozone without the protocol, we're talking way, way, way high. But with our protocol, we're seeing a decline slowly but surely and a return to pre-ozone hole level. So it's a win for planet Earth, but it's also a win for humankind because ozone protects us. Okay, it is estimated that over 400 million skin cancer cases were averted alone in the US. Okay, that's not thinking of all the other countries and all of the other health issues that can happen when you're exposed to too much UV light, like cataracts in your eyes, like for example. Okay, so I bring this up because it wasn't easy. Sherry Rowland discussed with folks in his older age about it was tough to become a scientist in the public eye. People claimed that he was out to make money or he was trying to, get rich off of the backs of industry. Obviously, industry was not thrilled to have to stop producing a compound that was making them millions of dollars. Okay. But 1995, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry went to these folks here for their work in atmospheric chemistry, particularly concerning the formation and decomposition of ozone. Okay. So with that in mind, let's be hopeful that we can work together with scientists and policy and international groups to make a change, to figure out what we're going to do about climate. That leads us to the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is an international agreement set forth to limit global average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. We're already at 1, so we want to stop it. Really, a lot of the framework is to stop it before 1.5 degrees. And the goals were to make financing flows consistent with pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions. It came into effect in 2016. The United States took a bit of a hiatus because of some politics. And then in 2021, we were re-entered into the Paris Agreement with all the world countries and the EU. What's really important about the Paris Agreement is that it allows for each country to decide what is best for them to cut emissions and then allows them to make a public commitment. So this doesn't, lead to the United States telling, Indonesia or China how to do what they need to do, right? It is a personal goal for each country. So I have a little video here about the Paris Climate Agreement.
The U.S. is back on board with the Paris Agreement. Now the real work begins. I'm Shannon Osaka, and I cover climate policy for GRIST. Ever think to yourself, wow, the world should really come together and do something about climate change? Well, it already has, sort of. So back in 2015, hundreds of countries got together at a big international meeting in Paris, and they pledged to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, or if they could swing it, 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, it wasn't exactly a legally binding agreement. It was more like kind of a general shared goal, reinforced by a healthy dose of public shaming.
Shame.
Every year, countries come together at these big international meetings, and they bring their goals to cut carbon emissions. Is it working? Kind of. Since 2015, emissions have actually kept climbing up until last year. As of right now, a bunch of countries have promised to totally zero out their emissions by 2050. But all of those pledges still aren't enough to keep us on the pathway to avoiding the worst climate impacts. The US is responsible for 15% of the world's total carbon emissions. And in 2017, President Donald Trump said this:
"The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord."
Okay, so then the 2020 election happened, and all of a sudden, the US wanted back in. But if the US wants to come back to an actual warm welcome, then it's going to have to do a pretty big gesture, like pledge to cut emissions by 45 to 50%. Other countries are going to want to see results, executive action, money, and most importantly, some kind of climate legislation from the US Congress. No matter what happens, having the US back in the Paris fold is going to be pretty good for the climate. For the past 4 years, some countries like Australia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia have kind of been hiding behind the bad behavior of the US and not really being their best climate selves. Now they'll be forced back into the spotlight. And the US could finally follow through on its original promise to give billions of dollars to poorer countries to help them build clean energy and adapt to the overheating planet. So even though the US rejoining the Paris Agreement is pretty much the lowest possible bar for addressing climate change, it's still a really big deal. But the real work is what comes next.
All right, so again, it's not really legally binding. No one can get in trouble, but the trouble is, the planet being on fire, right? So as mentioned, all of the countries involved in the Paris Climate Agreement, the current plans do not get us to below the 1.5. We'd have to have serious reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach that 1.5 degrees C threshold. And so then, thinking of United States policy, you may have heard of the Green New Deal. It was in the news a lot a few years back. It's kind of dwindled, but it's still a really important concept. And as mentioned, I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a social scientist. I really like this video from Vox here that goes into what the Green New Deal is, what it isn't, and why it matters. And this is the legislative need for our country in order to really cut our emissions. So we'll watch this, and we're almost done. Okay, so here's our Green New Deal.
Best climatologists. Every few years, they gather to tell us what's happening to our warming planet. In 2018, they had some news.
It's very clear that half a degree matters.
This is a chart of how much the global temperature has gone up since we discovered fossil fuels. For a long time, scientists said that we should try to stay under this line, 1.5 degrees Celsius. But that really, we'd be okay if we ended up below this line, 2 degrees. Now they were saying that wasn't quite right, that we're not safe in this zone, and that hitting this line will mean a spike in mass migration, wildfires, deadly heat stress, and it's going to cost us
trillions of dollars, millions of lives, irreversible, forever changes that cannot be undone in centuries.
That's what happens if we get warming to stop here. And right now, we're on track to go way past that.
If action is not taken, it will take the planet into an unprecedented climate future if we compare it to what has happened during all of human evolutionary history.
We don't have a plan for this. So a group of American activists started to make one. They recruited a congresswoman and a senator to turn it into a congressional resolution. It's the first step of a plan that has mostly yet to be written. It's called the Green New Deal. And inside, there's something we might not want to hear. This is the Green New Deal resolution. It's only 14 pages. And to understand what's in it, it's important to understand what's not.
It is not a bill. It's not legislation. It's not a policy proposal. It's not anything that you could pass and make law.
This is my colleague David Roberts. Dave's written a lot about the Green New Deal, and he says the 14-page resolution is just a first step.
The idea was, what's our shared understanding of the problem and what's necessary to solve it.
The Green New Deal contains basically two big ideas. The first is this question of what we need to do to solve the impending climate crisis. The Green New Deal says what climate scientists say. We need to completely stop burning fossil fuels as much as technologically feasible.
So that means things like rethinking vehicles, energy efficiency standards for buildings, changing the ways that we make steel and concrete.
That's Rihanna Gunn Wright. She's part of the think tank that came up with the Green New Deal.
Policy director of New Consensus.
Rihanna writes policy, and she likes to rattle off things that moving away from fossil fuels will entail.
Moving to electric vehicles, make that home energy efficient. The food that you buy will be grown locally.
The Green New Deal requires building a lot of new things, the things to power the world without fossil fuels. And that'll create new jobs, new industries, an entire new economy. But Rihanna also emphasizes that this is going to inflict a cost.
It's going to be a massive undertaking because we're actually asking how do we rethink the ways that we use energy in our society.
A key principle of the Green New Deal is that it's too late to incrementally move away from fossil fuels. It has to happen quickly and dramatically. Or as Dave puts it,
people don't seem to get zero emissions means zero oil business, means zero natural gas business, no coal business, no internal combustion engine auto business. Like, the number zero means it all has to go.
Here's what decarbonizing will do. When we rip out fossil fuels from the economy, people are going to lose their jobs. And that means they'll lose their healthcare, maybe their homes. But the Green New Deal also has a second part. And this part acknowledges that transitioning Americans away from fossil fuels is a huge and difficult ask, especially at a time when so many live in economic uncertainty.
How can we go to the American people and say, I sure hope you aren't one of the people who loses a job because then you might die like sick on the street. Good luck. Now will you sign my bill?
This is the contradiction the Green New Deal describes. It's the part we may not want to hear. That we need to take action, and also that taking action will cause pain. Imagine you're a coal worker. If the US decarbonizes, you are going to suffer. So the second part is a set of promises for how Americans will be protected during the transition away from fossil fuels.
Jobs guarantee, public employment, universal health care, education and training.
The basic elements of economic freedom that ought to be promised and due to every citizen of the richest country in the world.
And these promises aren't just for protecting coal workers. They're meant to keep all inequality from getting even worse during the transition. Because think about what direction wealth and power usually flow in when new things get built. It's the communities with the most political clout who decide where things can and can't be built. Wealthy corporations jump in to build those projects, and the good jobs go to the people who can afford to get trained for them.
The folks who have the fewest barriers will be the ones who benefit the most, and you're just going to see a replication of the issues that we have now.
In other words, anyone who's historically missed out on those benefits, especially the poor and people of color, could end up even worse off. So the Green New Deal says we should rebuild the American economy in a way that allows opportunity to flow more fairly.
The Green New Deal is about, while we have this chance, why don't we think about that proactively to change it in the ways that people have been calling for it to be changed for generations at this point.
So the first part of the Green New Deal is a set of goals to avoid a global disaster. The second part says we should do it in a way that helps ordinary Americans come out better on the other side. And that's it. That's all that's in these 14 pages. It's just a first step. And now, Rihanna's job is to figure out how to go from this 14-page resolution to an actual Green New Deal, a roadmap for what government needs to do next. And their goal is that if Democrats win power in 2020,
All right, so that's the Green New Deal. Obviously, it's not legislation. It's just an idea for how we can move forward in a way that helps and doesn't hurt people. Okay, so what can you do? I get this question asked often. And of course, everybody has a different lifestyle. Everybody has different means. But this is from the United Nations. These are your top 10 things. You can save energy at home, walk, bike, or take public transit, eat more vegetables, going into our food prints, consider your travel. Throw away less food, reduce, reuse, repair, recycle, change your home source of energy, switch to an electric vehicle, make your money count, Who are we buying from? Are the companies have our values, right? So that's a big thing for me lately has been to, what money I have. I'm not wealthy, but I'm going to make sure I support a company that is doing right for the planet. And also speaking up, right? If you can vote, you should be voting. Of course, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but obviously, as we've seen in this class, who's in power in the United States in terms of our government, it does matter in terms of what we're able to accomplish, and we know we need to make a difference. Climate justice means a lot of things, right? We think about climate justice, it's not straightforward, but when we do something to make our planet better, to reduce those carbon emissions, it's going to have long-lasting effects in other areas. For example, like cleaner air. And that's really important. We know that cleaner air matters. What other things can you do? Personal choices to reduce your contribution to climate change. This is from a scientific study in 2017 that shows your annual climate savings in terms of carbon emissions. So things like recycling, hanging your clothes to dry, or eating a plant-based diet, those things matter. And of course, if more people are doing them, that adds up. Switching to electric vehicles, avoiding round trip transatlantic flights, living car free. And this one at the end is a bit controversial. And of course, it's up to you, but it was having one fewer child, with the idea that the cumulative emissions from descendants is what matters, because those children would have children and they have children. And we know that people consume stuff. So this, again, is not my opinion. This is just a research study from 2017. Also, maybe you just don't ever want kids. Having pets does matter too. So here's a research study out of Arizona State and UC, the UC system, showing that pets also have greenhouse gas footprints, right? Because you have to feed those animals, and where are you getting the food for those animals? So, a cat has a almost similar footprint to a cow in terms of CO2 emissions because of the fact that they eat pretty heavy meat-based diets. So here is my last plug for our TA, Chris, and his wife, Jessica. I should actually call him Dr. Chris. He just recently earned his PhD on Tuesday, so we can congratulate him. But he and his wife, they own a zero waste market in Costa Mesa where you can go buy stuff like beans and sugars and sprinkles and your basic kitchen essentials without any plastic, which is really phenomenal because it's really hard to buy stuff these days that doesn't have single-use plastic in it. So that's my last plug for them. I really encourage you, every time I'm in Irvine, when I visit, I stop there. And my last remark is this image here. This is the pale blue dot from Voyager 1 in 1990, 3.7 billion miles from the sun. This little dot here, this little pale blue dot is us, our planet. Everything we know, everything we'll ever know in our lifetimes is really this planet. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Be sure you talk about climate change with everybody you know, even if they find you annoying, because it matters. It's our future, it's our livelihoods, it's our well-being. I just want to thank you all for working hard. I know these summer sessions go really fast, and I know I made some of you do Excel and you didn't like it, but I promise you, one day you're going to look back and say, wow, I'm using Excel now and I kind of know what I'm doing. I'm glad I took that summer session class. I will post a video this weekend about what's going to happen for your projects on Tuesday. But if you do have any questions, please email me or send me a message in Discord. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. But again, thank you so much. This is one of my favorite classes to teach, and I wish you all the best in whatever your next steps are. You're very welcome. Yeah, you're welcome for the Excel.
Hi, Dr. Nice.